I really appreciate you making time to connect on this. As I shared, it was an interesting kind of internal discussion that we were having just around content strategy in general. And we're seeing a lot more of a focus on the idea of content mix, right? It's not only about your own stuff. It's not only about other people's stuff. It's not only about earned media. It's this blending to create a narrative. And we had a customer, well, now a customer, a prospect at the time, talking about like, oh, this is a good thing to do, when I don't have time or I don't have a platform yet to talk about this. And I was like, well, I would challenge that. Maybe it's more than just that. It's about sharing your platform with others and bringing others into the conversation. And so your name came to mind, right, as someone who I've obviously followed for a long time across all of your different mediums, social, obviously, but also your site and your now work at HubSpot. And I feel like you've always done it right, in terms of
if that's true, it's been almost by accident then. But
well, that's what's interesting, right? Because it doesn't feel forced either, right? So you obviously have your own thought leadership and you're creating a lot of content, whether it's you plus pen or you plus team plus pens and keyboards kind of coming together. But it feels like still, I'd say 60% maybe. I don't know if you have a number in mind. You're also, hey, this is an interesting study that someone else had done, or this person has a unique perspective on what's happening in the industry or what's happening with customer success. So it's interesting that you share just by accident, because I'd love to hear how you think about that, right? Like, as someone who probably could just, if you had unlimited time, write it all and everyone, or record it all, and everyone would be like, yeah, I'm going to read it. I'm going to trust it. I'll even source it. But that you instead choose to find what other people are doing and kind of showcase that versus just sourcing it in your own piece. Yeah. How do you think about content like that?
All right. So again, with the caveat, I don't know that I've consciously thought through this. So this is a little bit like sort of
Perfect.
Back of my head of like, well, what is going through my head when I do this? To be honest, a lot of it for me, both what I write and what I share, starts with, I'm just trying to understand what the hell is going on in the world.
Awesome.
I mean, this space that I love of the intersection marketing and technology, it is just, there's so much changing all the time. And I even realized, for all the effort I put in trying to dig out what's happening, I'm always scraping just the tiniest fraction of it. But I enjoy it. I really enjoy learning what's going on here. And so it used to be, a lot of my research would be through that lens of okay, well, these are things I'm going to feed in and ultimately get into a post I write.
Right.
And I still do that.
Yep.
But the effort it takes me to write a post, I'm just a terribly slow writer. And so, yeah, I mean, you've seen this, if I do a couple posts a month, probably about my speed at this point, but at the same time, it's every day I'm reading, 2 or 3 things. And so I've just sort of gone in the habit of sharing it, partly, to, give credit where credit's due of people doing interesting things. But partly also is a bit of a trial balloon. The things I find interesting, it's useful to me when I share them to see, well, which things do other people find interesting? Which ones do they don't? I will say my ability to predict that is basically a coin flip at this point. Things I think people will love.
Yep.
Crickets. There's stuff that I share that, it was almost an afterthought. And all of a sudden, that's, the popular thing. And so, I'm probably not being very helpful here. It's
No, that's actually extremely helpful. That kind of trial balloon, idea of, hey, not only is this something top of mind, and as you said, everything's changing so dynamically, whether it's in the marketing and technology space. We work with a lot of financial services customers as well. And obviously things are moving at the speed of light there also. So, but being able to say well, I don't know which one of these things people are going to like. And maybe you have a hypothesis, but I'm not going to spend time creating 5 pieces then just to see crickets. I'll share it first and see what happens. And then do you find yourself kind of saying, oh, wow, this really started to work, or there's some interest there, so I'm going to now spend time, one of my 3 posts this month, if I have a chance to, I'm going to dig a little deeper into that based upon that reaction?
Yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, there was one I just did. It's surprised. I think this was actually my most popular LinkedIn post ever. And it was a completely random thing where I was complaining about, I'm not going to name the vendor out of respect for them, but I went to some vendor's page to try and understand what their new product was. And I read the whole page. I'm like, I just don't even understand.
I remember this post.
Okay, so I was just a little frustrated when I threw that out. And it was fascinating to me how many people, like, apparently that resonated with how they feel about much of this stuff. And so I covered that in my blog, in my podcast with Juan Mendoza. I don't know that I've quite incorporated that into a post yet, but that's one of those things where I'm like, okay, wow, there's something, first of all, it like resonates with me. Like, I'm like, yeah, this is worth digging into a bit more. But also, it's clearly a topic that people are frustrated about. So
very interesting. And so that sounds like one of the, and I know we're trying to oversimplify something that's probably very organic in what occurs, but hey, this hit a nerve, so something that I'm going to pursue further. Are there other kind of, I know this is a lot of introspection now, other kind of triggers in your mind of, you know what, this is something I'm going to actually write about, and I was maybe spurred by something I read, versus this is something I'm going to share with perspective with what I read? When do you kind of make the flip between it's worth creating something, whether it's a podcast topic or a written piece, versus I'm just going to share this with my thoughts?
So a lot of it comes down to there's an intentional and then sort of an accidental side of it. The intentional one is there's a handful of topics that I'm very interested in, and so for me right now, basically anything around integrations in the MarTech world, like I'm always keeping an eye out for those things. I tend to share them, but I also am collecting those things and find ways to work them into what I'm doing. A similar thing related to integration is like what's happening here with the evolving data layer inside companies. So I'm very intentional about trying to collect things on that. Those are probably the 2 top ones. And then there's things that's a little bit more accidental, this just happened because I did just write about this. Is that Gartner report came out, I don't know, a few weeks ago here about some subset of their here's what our people are saying about MarTech. And one of the stats they had in there is this thing about what people were reporting their utilization of MarTech is, and it was 58% last year, and now it's 42% this year. So it's a pretty significant drop. And don't get me started. I have all sorts of problems with that metric, but nonetheless, it's a really interesting. I mean, in the context of it was the post I wrote earlier this week of just people wrestling with the complexity of their tech stack. That was one of the things where that nugget from Gartner fed into it. There was another thing I'd seen. What was it? It was by Adverity, where they were talking about these are external factors that marketers feel, and so then that starts to feed into it's the external factors. There's complexity in the world, MarTech, is more of a reflection of that complexity than somehow the cause of that complexity. But that was kind of an example where I don't know that I was ever intentionally thinking I should write a post about this, but seeing 2 or 3 of those things out there, having shared a couple of them, the reaction was, I think in each of those cases, people interested in it. So
that's interesting. Post. And would you say that's evolved for you? How you approach that over the last, I know you've been kind of you've been chief martech now for what, close to 15 years, plus working in a founding organization previously, and now having a few years under the HubSpot umbrella. Have Has your approach to that kind of idea, do you feel like that's evolved, and in what way, or has it been more of a natural just progression of feeling things out and just kind of getting a gut read on, yep, this is worth sharing, this is worth writing about, this is worth just reading and consuming for future creation?
Yeah, there has been a pretty big shift, and I can very accurately attribute it, which is I feel in the first half of my tenure writing Chief Martech, there just wasn't a lot being written out there about this stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, going back to some of my older posts, a lot of it is almost first principle thinking, like, okay, well, there isn't stuff out here, but let's try and think through this. Versus, certainly over the past 5 years, I mean, just there's so many people doing so many amazing things. They're writing about it. There's surveys do this. It's opinion people. You got a whole ton of practitioners who, now have a lot of experience. They're sharing their things. And so there's just a lot more content out there to draw upon.
Yeah.
I think that probably has shifted my rating to be, I still try and do some of the first principles thinking just because I enjoy it. I'm fascinated by it. I like that process. But I think if you audited my posts over the past couple of years, you'd see probably at least half, if not more of them, are not first principle writing, but more like, hey, this thing from this survey or this thing that these folks were talking about, I find this interesting. Here's what I think relative to that. So it's kind of like there's a treasure trove of stuff out there that did not exist 7 years ago.
Well, that's at least an interesting piece. It has proliferated, if we can use that word, right? There's so much being written about it now. It almost has swung the pendulum in the other way, right? To know what's worth the read, what's deep enough, what has enough behind it versus somebody else's first principle thinking, without them disclosing that it was first principle thinking, but instead trying to pretend like it's been a fact-based, broad analysis. How do you deal with that fire hose, like for you? Because I'm sure you're getting so much, right? So many different signaling tools are out there. So much is just coming across your plate. Is that something that is very active of an approach, or is it at the point now where there's just, you only need to put your foot in the river and you'll find something interesting, right? What does it feel like to you, and how do you deal with trying to find what's worth putting out there?
I probably feel the same way like everyone in this industry does, which is just overwhelmed.
Yeah.
No, there's it's definitely one of those things that I could just sit here and the things that would naturally flow would be more than I could consume.
Right.
Medium's been really interesting to me. Again, like their algorithm. First, they have a ton of content, that's coming on fresh, but then their algorithm sort of learns what you're interested in, and so they figured me out pretty early on. Just my morning summary from Medium is more than I can consume. I subscribe to David Robb's newsletter, who, man, so there's so many things I love about David Robb, but damn, that newsletter, like every friggin' day, he's got 3 things, and almost every day, at least one of them is like, all right, I gotta click through on that. Like, wait, what? Check this out. And so if I did nothing else than just Medium and David Robb, I would have more than I could consume. But then on top of that, just in the nature of talking to people, whether it's from a HubSpot side or a Chief Martech side, all these topics come up, all these things that people are asking about or they're sharing their story with. And then that often for me triggers like proactive, like, oh, well, that's really interesting. Let me see what I can learn more about that. And again, there's no lack of that. Not getting many 0 hit search results on these things anymore.
And how much do you look into the author or the creator of that post when you're evaluating it? Medium is a good example, right? Everyone knows Medium, but it covers so much inside of Medium. for it to just be on Medium, it could be anything. But there's obviously a lot of really valuable stuff on Medium as well. So how deep do you go, and how early in your reading process do you figure out who wrote this before you kind of read the piece itself or watch the video?
Yeah, I mean, usually the if the headline catches me and I start reading it, I like it. Like if for whatever reason I start reading it and it's just not resonating with me, yeah, I don't even worry about who the author is.
Right.
If I've read it, I'm like, oh wow, that's really interesting. Then actually I will check out the author. It's funny, I don't actually think of it intentionally as a credibility check, although I guess inherently it is that. It's more, I just actually want to know who this person is, because
Yeah.
I want to follow them.
Right.
I'll look them up on Twitter. I'll add them in there. Yeah, I'm always like, sometimes Medium doesn't make this easy, but I'm always as intentional as I can be to credit who the folks are when I'm sharing
Sure,
their
of course.
stuff. And so sometimes, like their Medium isn't set up in a way to automatically do that, and you have to do a little hunting around. And but yeah, no,
Which Sam Smith is it that I'm looking at? Kind of an idea.
I'd
But
say it's content first, author second for me.
and that's what that's really interesting. Because I think for someone who may not be as familiar with the use of other content or third party, or even including that, right? We hear this quite a bit of, oh, these are the publishers, right, that I want to find content from. And then they go next to the thematic areas. And I kind of lean in your direction of, well, let's see who's writing stuff, because especially if it's in a fast moving environment, the old guys may not be the people anymore, right, who are writing the best stuff. And there's an up and comer who's writing really interesting, unique perspectives, because maybe they don't have all the shackles that a quote unquote authoritative publisher would. So it's interesting that you take similar content first, and then more from a what else did this person create than a gatekeeper for what you're going to read.
Yeah, almost no one I read is like what I would think of as a journalist. I mean, there are some I run across who are great, but almost all of them either fall into one of three camps. They're either a practitioner themselves,
Right.
and those are great. Like when because everything else you really do have to take with a grain of salt. But
Yes.
the practitioners, they're where the ground truth is.
Mhm.
The second, though, is I do find, particularly with startups and the founders, they have thought so deeply about the problem that they're trying to solve that, I find they write some really great pieces. Now, there's almost always a bias, as you would expect, to kind of promote their view. But if they do a great job of like actually explaining the problem, and for them, maybe even explaining what they think the solution is, I find those things to be really fascinating. And then maybe the third bucket, kind of similar in that, is there's become a handful of these VCs who, it's part of their mission to try and think deeply about spaces and trends, and like, what's his name, Thomas Tongues, just some of these people who, like, my goodness, they're just, the way they think about it and their ability to eloquently write about it is fantastic. And so I don't know, those are sources I think tend to have more interesting things to me than
Absolutely.
traditional journalism. But
That's very interesting. And one of the other questions on kind of the medium, not that medium, but the actual medium of the content, when you find that you're sharing things from others, I've seen PDFs, I've seen the articles themselves, right, that you've shared and added your perspective to as well. It's been very rare that I've seen just kind of a repost of an article. Usually it has kind of Scott's view included in it as well. How much time do you spend in kind of thinking about that view? What does that process look like for you? Finding it, reading it's one thing. Sharing it with that, curated perspective, I think is another.
Yeah, this is where I would say, curated perspective is definitely overstating the case. But, I think the closer term to it would be a hot take.
Yeah.
You try and attach something of like, oh, why did I find this interesting, or is this something I would endorse? But yeah, I don't give more than 30 seconds thought to that.
And I think that's important because I think there's a lot of, particularly those who are less used to, right, writing or get afraid of the blinking cursor. Like this doesn't need to be your Shakespearean novella, right, of what you're writing about this article. Really, kind of the why did you read it? I think that's an interesting point. Just be authentic, right? And you, as you had shared, that one most viral, if we want to call it that, right, LinkedIn post was emotion around frustration on reading a site and not really getting anything from it other than a bunch of, I think it was a lot of keywords and buzzwords and things, right, that came out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and left with nothing. So it's, I think it's great to hear about just top of mind. Like the hot take idea, I think is fantastic. And probably you see some, I would expect, resonance with those hot takes because it is a connector point then with other people.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think one of the things I was traditionally quite bad at was I wouldn't pick up the conversation after sharing the initial
Oh,
thing.
okay. Interesting.
And I have to say, like, part of this is I was just bad at it, but the other thing is I kind of feel like the environment's changed now, where on LinkedIn, I'm finding the discussions that sometimes happen around these pieces are actually really interesting. And yeah, I mean, again, it's the LinkedIn algorithm. I've finally discovered this after 20 years or whatnot. But like, yeah, I start engaging,
Right.
people come in from that, we get more engagement. It becomes, it takes on a life of its own. That again is like really interesting to me, because all this goes back to the original thing where I'm just trying to figure out what the hell's going on.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it is really interesting to me to have these other people weigh in with their opinions and their, their experiences. And if I, push back on one of it, they'll reply back and give me the reason why they, think I'm full of it and they've got the right way for it. And it's like, oh, this is awesome. Like, I mean, I could lose way too much time in that, so I have to moderate it still. But
Yes. Yes. Time
yeah,
block
I'm
that.
really excited about some of these, like, discussions that seem to happen around this stuff, which in some ways I think is actually making it harder for me to blog, because yeah, I keep investing more time in the threads in LinkedIn, but
That's very interesting. So kind of tying all this stuff together, I think for like the, either you think about it as like the past Scott, right? Or the person who also wants to kind of figure out what the heck's going on, right? Try to position themselves as a place to go for conversation, be thought about in whatever space they're in as that person. Like how would you recommend they get started in that process, whether it is content related or something more general? We have a lot of individuals who are either in sales or they are a founder or executive, and they want to be a resource to customers, others in the industry, kind of that person, right? But what's the first step in that kind of a process?
yeah, I mean, it's, again, my approach to this has taken 15 years, so it's like it was a very slow burn.
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like when I think about it, I feel like there's a blend of two things that I think resonates with people. One of them is bringing facts or data to the table. Now, I should probably put it facts in quotes, because very often a lot of these things I'm citing or triggering off of are surveys, and
Sure.
most of these surveys have, yes, any professional survey person would be like, oh my god, yeah, this is oh my, yeah, just no, this data sucks.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, it's at least a very, maybe factual is the rest, not the best way to put it, but very concrete. Like there's something like you can like say, all right, this is really specific and we can talk about that.
Yes.
And then I think pairing that with being human, I've tried over time to like inject more of my personality and more of my bizarre sense of humor into these things. I cannot say for a fact this is working. For all I know, it actually has depressed what my potential audience could have been. But it makes the writing more enjoyable for me. And
you're having more fun doing it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the audience it does resonate with, I think that's one of the reasons it does resonate, is because I'm not, again, like some of the journalism out there, and again, no offense to, journalists writing on this, but it's, a very, sort of factual, by the book sort of thing. And I don't know, I feel like this stuff is both, it's so complex and so challenging in so many ways that, like, we need to have a little bit of fun with some of this too, just to like get our way through it. But if it's too dry, like, it's a hard slog.
And kind of like you said, like, nobody knows what's going on, right? I mean, it's just more of a collective knowledge, and we can kind of directionally feel like where the masses are moving, but there is no known map of where things are going. So I think that's a big piece of it too. That's great. Scott, I know we're coming close on the 30-minute time window. Anything else that, as you think about your kind of content strategy, particularly use of third-party content, that I didn't ask about, or that you think would be helpful to someone who's considering how, why, when should I be thinking about content in a mix with my own?
Yeah, I can't think of anything. Again, like, I think you've given me far too much credit for a content strategy. So yeah, I would definitely take everything I've said with a grain of salt. Yeah, if any of that's helpful.
I think it's great. Hugely helpful. I particularly enjoyed the hot take idea on so I think sometimes we take ourselves too seriously, right? And try to portray ourselves as someone who we're not, and end up finding out, like you said, that the people who we want to be engaging with are the ones who also want to engage with us as the person that we are, not just some like stoic bestower of knowledge onto the world. I thought that was great. And then the content first, publisher second, I think was an interesting idea as well. So a lot of really helpful bits in here.